Okay, I'm Wendy Stevenson, and I work for the Converging World, and I'm also the trustee on the Tree Sisters. The Converging World invests in renewable energy, and then we use the surplus of that to reforest the tropics. And it would be a great way to we need more money, we need more reforestation. And one great way of doing that is to get more funding into that. And what we're looking to do is we're looking to list on the AIM market, where we can raise money to put in more renewable energy, which will mean more profit, which will mean more reforestation, because we have to accelerate reforestation. Back in 2015, the UN Climate Change and Reforestation Committee came out and said that we must accelerate reforestation to avoid catastrophic climate change. And when they said that, they also said that we've got to engage the civil society, the public sector and the private sector. And my immediate thought was, that's great, but how are we going to make that happen? And I was looking for a collective response, and there wasn't one. And I think this tree conference would be great, because it could be the beginning of a collective response to such a claim. And so how do we do that? And there are barriers, I believe, that are preventing the acceleration of reforestation that have actually come down through the Kyoto Protocol. And if we can address those barriers, I think it would be much easier for civil society, the public sector and the private sector to engage in that process of reforesting the tropics and our own country. So a lot of targets that are set to sort of neutralise or at least balance carbon emissions by 2050. A lot of us believe that's far too long to wait, because we're already sort of running out of time in terms of the kickbacks. So a lot of I know that there's a number of organisations that have come out and said we'll go carbon neutral by 2050. That includes Bristol City Council, it includes M&S, it includes Virgin, it includes all of those. But actually that's achieving it through what I might call green bling. And there's a good place for green bling. We need solar, we need wind, we put in wind turbines, and we need energy efficiency measures. But we've got to remember that avoids CO2. It doesn't sequester CO2 from the atmosphere. Reforestation and soil management, good solid soil management, will actually sequester CO2. And if we focused, and if the Kyoto Protocol and if the regulations allowed us to engage globally in accelerating reforestation and better soil management, then we would be able to meet that target much sooner, even by 2020, some believe. So people often ask, should we be planting here in the UK or should we be planting in the tropics? Well, of course, the answer is both. However, if you're asking the question, what is the most effective way to reduce CO2? Then obviously it's planting in the tropics. And if we want to accelerate the rate at which we pull down, we sequester CO2, then we've got to plant in the tropics. And the most cost-effective way to reduce CO2 is actually by planting trees in the tropics. If I look at planting a wind turbine, if I install a wind turbine in India, it'll cost me about £200 to avoid a ton of CO2. To avoid a ton of CO2, it doesn't sequester it. It doesn't take out our sort of industrial levels of CO2. It just avoids it. If we plant a tree in the tropics, it'll cost just $10 to reduce 1 ton of CO2, but it actually sequesters it, so it does reduce it. Installing renewable energy doesn't reduce CO2, it just avoids more CO2 going into the atmosphere. But we need it all. We need wind farms, we need solar, we need energy efficiency, and we need reforestation. And at the moment, the Kyoto Protocol, the way that those regulations are implemented, are actually preventing us accelerating reforestation. It is, according to Nicholas Stern and many others, the most cost-effective way to reduce CO2. And it has many other benefits. 1 in 4 people live from the forest. And biodiversity, 80% of it is in the forests. So it's not just about CO2 sequestration. And let's face it, we can't live without them, and we behave like we can. So what's preventing large-scale reforestation in the UK? I think there are many things that are preventing that, and one of them is ironically, conservation. Because sometimes we stop at the level where the grassland, there's some rare grasses there, and we don't allow it to naturally develop, and so that natural succession does not happen. And that means that our woodlands don't come back. So that's one reason. Another reason, it's linked with the ownership of the woodlands. And a lot of the ancient forests that were cleared have been replaced with coniferous forest because it's a crop and therefore it will make money. And of course, rewilding. Yes, we do need to rewild. We need the megafauna to come back. And a lot of the uplands have been prevented from actually being rewilded back to forest land. So those are often the main reasons why. And I think we've become separate. We forget, actually, that we are a symbiotic. We are trees and trees are us, whether we like it or not. We can't live without them. How do we actually improve and increase the woodland cover in the UK? We have to engage people back with forests. We have to help them understand how important they are, not just in terms of, well, they're our life support system, they're our lungs, but also how rich they make. There are products that come from that, how rich they make us in terms of the biodiversity, well-being, as well as their products. We have named some of the barriers to preventing that happening. So we need new targets, we need changes in regulation, we need a different, fresh outlook by the wildlife trusts that will actually encourage reforestation to actually go back to where we were so that we can see more megafauna. And of course, we need access to capital. We need access to capital, and one of the ways in which we're hoping to do that, which we would love others to follow, is that we're investing in renewable energy, and then we would use the surplus of that for reforestation, because it's difficult to invest in a woodland and see a return that the capital market would expect unless you're going to cut it down. But we don't want to cut it down because we want to invest in natural capital, which doesn't have the kind of return the capital markets are looking for. So finding other ways to make money that we can then put into natural capital, where we're not looking for a financial return, but just a social and environmental return, is one of our strategies going forward. I've got a question for Al Gore and for Nick Stern and for the UN Committee on Climate Change and Reforestation, which apparently the UK are part of. How are we going to accelerate reforestation? You released this statement saying that we needed to accelerate reforestation to avoid catastrophic climate change. I didn't see a response. I tried to find the UN Committee on Climate Change and Reforestation because there seems to be a mismatch. Because at the moment, the UK, for example, has its Kyoto National Action Plan. It has been agreed at the Paris talks. It is now implementing that in the UK. So I'm a large industrial user, or I'm under the carbon reduction commitment, and I want to accelerate CO2 reduction on the planet. But I can't do that through reforestation, because the way that they have translated the targets into UK legislation prevents businesses achieving their CO2 targets through reforestation. So when the UN Committee on Climate Change and Reforestation come out and say, we need to engage everybody in this process, my question is, how are you going to do that when the regulations put in the barrier that prevents them from doing it? So can we have a conversation about how we can make that happen?